A diver zip ties a young boy's hands behind his back. He injects a powerful surgical anesthetic into the child's leg. Seconds later, the boy goes completely unconscious. The diver seals a silicone oxygen mask over the child's face, then pushes his limp body into freezing black water. The tunnels ahead are so narrow, the child's skull will slam against the rocks. If the sedative wears off underwater, he will panic and drown instantly. This wasn't torture. It was the only possible way to save his life. The Tham Luang Cave in northern Thailand is a massive, winding limestone labyrinth. It is a geographical trap waiting to be triggered. In June 2018, 12 young boys and their soccer coach walked into the cavern for an afternoon hike. They left their bicycles near the entrance, planning to explore for an hour and be out by dinner. But the sky suddenly broke open. A massive, unseasonal monsoon storm dumped millions of gallons of water onto the mountain. The water didn't just flood the cave, it violently exploded through the narrow tunnels. It trapped the team 2.5 miles deep inside the earth. They were completely swallowed by absolute suffocating darkness. They had no food, they had no light, they had absolutely no way to call for help. For 9 terrifying days, the outside world assumed they were already dead. When 2 elite British cave divers finally breached a deep, muddy chamber and found them alive, the entire world celebrated. But the celebration was a total Finding the boys was a stroke of incredible luck. Getting them out alive was mathematically and physically impossible. Between the trapped boys and the surface was a deadly obstacle course of flooded, jagged rock. The water was pitch black, freezing and moving with the violent force of a raging river. Some tunnels were so narrow that divers had to take off their air tanks just to squeeze their chests through the stone. This is an environment that actively kills professional, highly trained cave divers. And the trapped boys were starving, severely weakened, and did not even know how to swim. The initial government plan was to simply wait for the monsoon season to end. They would drop supplies, and the boys would sit in the dark for 4 months while the water naturally receded. But the mountain had other plans. The oxygen levels inside their small air pocket began to plummet. Normal atmospheric air is 21% oxygen. Inside the sealed chamber, it was dropping dangerously below 15%. At 12%, the human brain begins to systematically shut down. They were slowly, quietly suffocating in the dark. The absolute urgency spiked when a former Thai Navy SEAL named Saman Kunan tried to deliver oxygen tanks to the chamber. He was a highly trained, elite military diver in peak physical condition. He ran out of air and died in the freezing, muddy water. If the cave could easily kill an elite Navy SEAL, it would absolutely slaughter a panicked child. You cannot teach a starving 12-year-old how to safely navigate a zero-visibility underwater maze. If a boy panicked underwater, human instinct would take over. He would violently rip the air regulator out of his mouth in a desperate attempt to breathe. He would drown in seconds. Worse, his thrashing body would easily drown the rescue diver tied to him. A conscious rescue was guaranteed mass suicide. The lead rescue divers realized there was only one terrifying option left on the table. They had to completely bypass the boys' human survival instinct. They had to turn them into lifeless cargo. The authorities called in Dr. Richard Harris. He was an Australian anesthetist and an elite cave diver. He was asked to do something that violated every core rule of modern medical. He had to medically induce a coma in 12 starving children deep inside a flooded cave with absolutely no hospital equipment. When Dr. Harris first heard the plan, he completely refused. He told the military it was a guaranteed death sentence. Putting a heavily unconscious person underwater is the exact medical definition of drowning. If a boy's head tilted the wrong way, his airway would collapse. If the silicone mask leaked even a fraction of an inch, his lungs would instantly fill with muddy water. Dr. Harris predicted a 0% survival rate. He believed every single child would die in the water, but the oxygen in the chamber was critically low. Cases like this force humans to make the most horrifying gambles on Earth. And if the absolute edge of survival is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero. because what happened under the water was pure medical horror. The extraction officially began. The rescue divers surfaced in the muddy chamber, surrounded by the starving children. They didn't give the boys a choice in the matter. Dr. Harris administered a heavy cocktail of powerful drugs. First, an anti-anxiety pill was given to calm their racing hearts. Then, atropine was injected to dry up the saliva in their mouths, ensuring they wouldn't choke on their own spit while paralyzed. Finally, he pulled out a syringe of ketamine. Ketamine is a powerful surgical anesthetic. It completely disconnects the brain from the physical body. Dr. Harris injected it directly into the first boy's leg. Within seconds, the child's eyes rolled back into his head. His body went completely limp, slumping heavily onto the wet mud. The rescue divers immediately grabbed the unconscious boy. They pulled his arms securely behind his back. They tightly zip-tied his wrists together. They tied his ankles. This wasn't to punish him. It was a brutal, unavoidable necessity. If the ketamine wore off early, a thrashing, panicked child would violently rip off his own breathing mask in the narrow tunnels. Hog-tying them was the only possible way to prevent a fatal underwater struggle. They forced a positive pressure full-face mask over the boy's head. They tested the seal, listening carefully for the hiss of continuous oxygen. Then the rescue diver grabbed a handle on the boy's harness. He pushed the unconscious child face first into the freezing black water. The journey out took over 3 excruciating hours. The diver had to swim blindly through a jagged obstacle course, dragging the boy like a heavy duffel bag. Visibility was absolutely zero. The water was a washing machine of swirling mud and debris. The diver couldn't even see the child strapped to his own chest. He had to constantly reach down in the dark and feel the boy's ribs just to make sure he was still breathing. The physical reality of the extraction was deeply brutal. The narrow limestone tunnels were entirely unforgiving. As the diver squeezed through tight gaps, the boy's head would violently smash against the jagged rock ceilings. The child couldn't brace for impact. He was completely limp, taking the full, crushing force of the stone directly against his skull. But the physical trauma wasn't the biggest threat hiding in the water. Ketamine is not a long-lasting drug. It naturally wears off in roughly 45 minutes. The dive took 3 full hours. This meant the boys would inevitably start waking up underwater. Deep inside the flooded mountain, a rescue diver felt a sudden, violent jerk on his tether. The boy he was dragging was starting to twitch. The heavy drug was wearing off. The child's brain was actively waking up in an underwater nightmare. He was bound, blind, and submerged in freezing water. The diver had to act immediately before the boy went into full cardiac panic. He pulled the thrashing child onto a small, muddy airbank in the middle of the cave. He pinned the boy down in the pitch black. He pulled a preloaded syringe of ketamine from his wetsuit pocket. Stabbing the needle directly through the boy's thick neoprene wetsuit, he injected another heavy dose right into his thigh. He held the boy down to the mud until the body went entirely limp again. Then, he shoved him right back under the freezing water. This terrifying medical reset had to be repeated multiple times for every single boy. The divers were constantly hovering on a razor-thin line. One drop too much and it was a fatal overdose. One drop too little and the boy woke up to drown. Every single checkpoint in the cave was a massive, lethal gamble. If a mask got bumped by a sharp rock and broke its seal, the diver wouldn't know. The boy couldn't tap his shoulder or signal for help. He would simply silently inhale water and die in his sleep. The divers were swimming with the immense psychological weight of carrying dead weight that was supposed to be alive. The stress of the dive pushed the rescuers to the absolute brink of human endurance. At Chamber 3, the staging area for the final push, military medics waited in absolute dread. When the first diver finally broke the surface, he dragged the limp, hog-tied body out of the water. The boy was completely blue from the freezing cold. He wasn't moving. The medics rushed forward, violently cutting the thick zip ties off his wrists. They checked for a pulse. It was faint, was there. He was still breathing. Over the next 3 days, this terrifying cycle was repeated 12 more times. Inject the drug, zip tie the wrists, drown them in sleep, drag them through the rock. Dr. Harris was the very last man out of the dark chamber. He walked out of the cave fully expecting to hear that half the soccer team had perished in the flooded tunnels. Instead, he received an impossible medical report. Every single boy survived. The coach survived. The most dangerous, medically unethical extraction in human history had somehow worked flawlessly. The world watched the ambulances speed away from the mountain base. The media celebrated a brilliant, heroic, and clean rescue operation, but the authorities heavily censored the actual detail of the extraction. They told the press the boys were just mildly sedated and helped swim themselves out. They lied. They knew the global public could not handle the brutal, graphic reality of the mission. They couldn't broadcast footage of children being handcuffed, drugged into deep comas, and shoved underwater like corpses. It took years for the absolute truth of the medical horror to finally leak to the public. The physical wounds on the boys eventually healed. They woke up in bright, sterile hospital rooms surrounded by their weeping families. They were hailed worldwide as absolute miracles of survival. But you cannot simply erase what the mountain demanded from them. The boys have absolutely no memory of the 3-hour journey through the violent dark. They closed their eyes in a starving, muddy cavern. They opened them in a safe hospital bed. They survived the cave. They made it back to the sun. But they had to die in the dark to get there.